Hello and welcome to Farm Connections. I'm your host, Dan Hoffman. On today's program, we have a conversation with Karin Schaefer, the new Executive Director at the Minnesota Farm Bureau, talking about her background and her plans for the future of the Bureau. We meet Batt, writer, storyteller, and avid ornithologist. And the University of Minnesota Extension provides us with a new Best Practices segment. All here today on Farm Connections.
Welcome to Farm Connections with your host, Dan Hoffman.
Farm Connections made possible in part by
Absolute Energy. A locally owned facility produces 125 million gallons of ethanol annually, proudly supporting local economies in Iowa and Minnesota. Absolute Energy, adding value to the neighborhood. The Agricultural Utilization Research Institute, collaborating with businesses and entrepreneurs to foster long-term economic benefit for Minnesota through value-added agricultural products. You can learn more at auri.org.
We're so honored to have Karin Schaefer from the Minnesota Farm Bureau Federation with us today. She's serving as their new executive director, second day on the job. Welcome, Karin.
Thank you for having me.
Well, what a thrill it is. And we want to learn a little bit about Farm Bureau, of course, but also about your past. What have you done before you came back to be their executive director?
Yeah, so that's kind of been a great story. I started here at the Minnesota Farm Bureau fresh out of college, but then quickly worked into a role of special programs coordinator, where I manage the Young Farmer and Rancher program and then also the promotion and education program. Spent 6 years here at the Minnesota Farm Bureau and then moved on to serve as the executive director of the Minnesota Beef Council. So the Beef Council oversees all of the beef checkoff programming in the state. And then also we partner with the Minnesota State Cattlemen on kind of working on some of their policy initiatives as well. And so it was fun to get this chance to come back to Farm Bureau. Many of the staff members are familiar faces to me. There are definitely some new ones, but even the board, it was a friendly group of familiar faces that I knew fairly well. So I'm excited. It feels like coming home.
Well, you certainly have a great background that I believe will bring some good things to the Federation. The mission you spoke of Farm Bureau, if you could just condense that down into the mission statement, what is that?
So the Minnesota Farm Bureau's mission is to be an advocate for agriculture based on the beliefs of its members. So basically, we are a voice. And I think the great thing about Farm Bureau is, we have Farm Bureau representation across the whole state with county and local farm bureaus. We represent all different types of commodity organizations. We represent all different sizes and scales of operation. And so I think that gives Farm Bureau a unique voice and a unique authority to kind of represent these issues. And sometimes there's challenges in that what's good for one sector isn't always good for the other. And I think that's a great opportunity for our members and our leadership to really sift through these initiatives and these policy issues to ensure that, we're not misstepping or making a unintended consequence by moving forward one policy initiative at the cost of another segmentation. So I think Farm Bureau is really has a great opportunity moving forward, and they have done it to lead and to bring folks together and to really, synergize our industry and making sure that we're speaking holistically about agriculture.
Well, after you left Farm Bureau Federation for in the communications role and the other things you did, you spent some time with the Minnesota Beef Producers Council, correct?
Correct, yeah.
So what was your work there?
So the Minnesota Beef Council works on behalf of all beef farmers and ranchers in the state of Minnesota with the checkoff program. So a portion of proceeds are collected to do general research, education, and promotion for our industry. We did a lot of work connecting consumers with the information they needed to know about how to purchase beef, how to safely prepare beef, how to shop for beef. And then we also worked with various institutions to fund research projects that would help beef safety issues, would help to understand how we can improve sustainability in the beef industry, and also to really explore if there's some ways that we can innovate on carcass fabrication and making sure that we're utilizing every part of the beef animal. And so that was a really wonderful opportunity, not only just to work directly with the board of directors as their point person to manage a team and a staff, to manage a budget and to manage, the marketing program that we were working on and how to make sure that we were providing metrics for the work that we were doing. But I think what I enjoyed the most about it was this opportunity to interface with consumers and making sure that they heard producers and understood what farmers and ranchers across the state and across the country do to raise high quality beef products that they can purchase in their grocery store. And I kind of see that that's a fun angle that Farm Bureau can also bring in making sure that we're bridging that gap between producers and consumers.
Well, it's a very important work. And Karen, you mentioned the checkoff. Many of our commodity groups, corn, soybean, pork, and others, the farmers actually take some of their own proceeds and use it for promoting the product and research. Beef is no exception. Can you elaborate on that just a little bit?
Yeah, I like to give the example. I grew up on a dairy farm. The milk that we raised on our dairy farm went to Bongard's Creamery, and I knew that it was turned into cheese, and I could go and purchase that product in the grocery store. And I felt this great tie and this great connection to, the hard work that we do on our farms and ranches. In the beef industry, it's a little different in that there's many different segmentations of the beef industry, whether you're a cow-calf operator, you're a backgrounder or stocker operator, which is the type of farm that my husband and my father-in-law and I run, or else you're a cattle finisher. And so sometimes there's a bit of a disconnect between if the beef in the grocery store is directly tied to you and your product that you're raising on the farm. And so these checkoff programs do a great job of giving producers ownership of how to market the general commodity that they raise, whether that's through advertising efforts. Research is a huge part of that. And also just making sure that we're giving a voice to the producer. So much of the branding and marketing in most of our commodities comes as a finished product, whether it's a finished branded beef product, whether it's, various end products of corn and soybean that, maybe the producers lost a little bit in that translation. And so it's giving the farmers and ranchers a direct voice. The funds are collected under law. They're managed by producers for producers. The elections of these folks that serve on these boards are voted on by farmers and ranchers and their counterparts. And so I think it's a great opportunity for them to have more of a voice in that finished product and making sure that they're connecting what's done on the farm to consumers and the general public.
Do the farmers find it a little frustrating when they spend literally decades and millions of dollars to promote good farm products when politicians sometimes get involved in the process and put up trade barriers?
Yeah, that's definitely a challenge. And I know most of the commodity organizations policy side really get frustrated when decisions are made without science behind them. Not only do most of our checkoffs fund this great science work, but we also think that policy should be driven on factual information that's supported with science. And oftentimes when policies come forth without that background and that foundation of scientific evidence, we see that they're often not successful. And if a elected official wants to really create change, making sure that they have the justification with science is always going to be the better avenue.
Karen, our food, our feed, our fiber, that industry is so important to our livelihood and also life itself. You mentioned young farmers. When somebody wakes up someday, they don't just automatically become a farmer. It's a journey. And certainly developing young farmers is important. But you'll be working in St. Paul. You'll be working in the larger region or the upper Midwest. You'll be working in Washington, D.C., and even internationally. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the opportunity to train leaders is something that Farm Bureau has done so well. In talking about not only just how to make sure that they're equipped to be successful farmers, but part of that profession, if you will, is to be an advocate for your industry and to be vocal and to be involved in policy efforts in St. Paul, in Washington, D.C., being involved in trade initiatives across, the globe. I think that's where Farm Bureau really accelerates in making sure that we're, thinking outside of just our farm field and how can we ensure the livelihood of our cattle producers, our livestock producers, our crop producers, and making sure that the work that they're doing isn't hindered by unnecessary regulation and legislative efforts.
Thank you, Karin Schaefer, newly selected Executive Director of the Minnesota Farm Bureau Federation.
Thank you, Dan.
Stay tuned for more on Farm Connections.
Farm Connections Best Practices brought to you by
Hi, I'm Ryan Miller, Crops Extension Educator with the University of Minnesota Extension. And today we're going to talk a little bit about corn weed management. Now, herbicides and herbicide programs are a keystone for weed management in corn systems in southern Minnesota. Today, we're going to focus on different timing strategies for herbicide programs. The first strategy we want to address is the pre, followed by a post-emergence application strategy. This can work well. Typically, we start with a very robust pre-emergent herbicide program following the planting of corn. And then we come back in, and as a best practice, we use our post-emergence herbicide at about 3-inch tall weeds. We're going to really target those smaller weeds to get good effective control. This system works particularly well in southeast Minnesota because we know one of our best practices for fertilizer management in corn is to do spring pre-plant nitrogen. And when we make that fertilizer application, we can have that fertilizer impregnated with a herbicide program to kind of get us started in the season. So essentially we're killing two birds with one stone. The next strategy I want to talk about is the total pre strategy. There's a couple of products on the market nowadays that this strategy can work very well. It's going to require activation, so enough rainfall to get the herbicides moving. But in southeast Minnesota, we typically get enough rainfall to get these programs up and going. So we plant corn, come in with our full herbicide program for the year right after planting, rely on that activating rain to get things going and to give us good weed control, just not allowing the weeds to emerge. And so that is one strategy that can work. Now there is some risk associated with that. If we don't get that activating rainfall or enough activating rainfall, we can see some weeds start to emerge. And so a way to deal with some of that risk is to take that program and actually split it apart. So we start with about half the rate down as a pre, and then come back early post with the second half of that application. And so the best practice there is to typically target 1 to 2 inch tall weeds with our split application. The final strategy we want to talk about is the total post system. Now we're not looking at a total post like some people used to do where we don't use residual chemistries. It's really what we're going to need is a strong residual, but we wait till the weeds start to emerge and we come out there and we have a product that can both kill the weeds that have emerged as well as provide a strong residual base moving through the season. So typically what the best practice is here for this timing is to look at a early post at a 1 to 2 leaf corn stage or 1 to 2 inch tall weeds, so very, very early in the season. The challenging thing with this concept is going to be making sure we have adequate time to cover our acres at that really tight window, with we got to get back in that field 1 to 2 inch tall weeds, and that can be a challenge. For more information on specific herbicide programs or products that can work with these various timings, you can check out our website at z.umn.edu/crops and look under weed management. We've got plenty of efficacy trials that you can take a look at and pick a product or product combination that will fit your practice. Thanks. I'm Ryan Miller, Extension Educator with the University of Minnesota Extension, and that was today's Best Practices segment.
Today we have the delight of having Batt, writer and storyteller extraordinaire. Al, welcome to Farm Connections.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's great to be. I'm pleased as punch to be here.
Storytelling is a long time historic thing. Before the printed word, before the printing press, stories and legacies were carried on by people like you and family members who told stories. But never before have we ever had a greater need for connectivity and understanding and also being rooted. And you are the master of those things. How did you get started in storytelling anyway?
We didn't have a TV. My dad, I used to think he was cheap till I became him. Now I realize he was just frugal and wise with his money. And he thought it was a waste of time. So when we came to the supper table, because in those days we ate supper at night, we ate breakfast in the morning, then we had lunch, then we had dinner, then we had lunch again in mid-afternoon, then we'd have supper. And then before we went to bed, we had lunch again. But at supper, we were to bring a story to the table, something that happened in school, something that happened on the farm. And nobody was supposed to make fun of anybody. You know, we were supposed to laugh if it was funny, but we were supposed to tell those stories. And when I'd come home from school, my mom would be waiting in the kitchen doing the dishes. And she asked the same question every day of my school life. How was school today? Or what did you learn in school today? Sometimes she'd vary a little bit to throw me off. And when she said, what did you learn in school today? There were days, Dan, when I hadn't learned any. So I had to make up a story quick. It might have been something happened to another kid, but I'd make it up and it sound good. And mom would smile and laugh. And I loved my mom. I love my dad, but I loved my mom to smile and laugh. There was no greater thing in life than hearing her laughter. She always said, I found a teehee's nest with a ha-ha's egg in it. And she would laugh uncontrollably till tears would run just because of some stupid story I told. And I think my dad not having a TV, he was one of 12 kids, they told stories. And I loved the Batt family reunions. We go down to Iowa. And I love those stories they would tell. I think I'd go to my Uncle Bill's. He was a barber in Burt, Iowa for 62 years. And I'd sit in there with all those cronies in the barbershop and they'd tell stories. And my mom would say, I hope you don't believe anything they say in your uncle's barbershop. I said, no, I believed everything they said. It was so wonderful hearing those guys tell stories. And they would pass on their history, their family's history, the town's history, the barbershop history, and in the process, my history. My best teachers were storytellers, and they would hook me with a story because I would go in there. I wasn't going to learn anything. I thought, well, this is a waste of time. I know everything already. What am I doing here? And they'd tell a story, and before I knew it, I'd learned all kinds of things. Those wonderful teachers. Story has a great power. The world isn't made of atoms. It's made of stories. There's a rabbi who said God created man so he could hear our stories. And I think part of that is true. Mrs. Sibrid was a good friend of my mom. And in Heartland, we had first and second grade, Mrs. Demmer, third and fourth, Mrs. Sibrid, fifth and sixth, Mrs. Bach. And sometimes they'd call you by a sibling's name, which wasn't too bad, except when they'd say Georgiana, which was my sister. And it was bad enough I had to wear her hand-me-downs. Those high-heeled pumps were they were brutal on me, but you wore what you had to wear. They were the greatest teachers. And Mrs. Demmer was just, she yelled. Mrs. Sibrid was one who whispered everything and made you lean in like a good storyteller. When they're telling story, you lean in because you don't want to miss any of the words. That was Mrs. Sibrid. And I can remember so many times in there. There was a bird field guide that was in the class. We had one. And I was the only one that would check it out. We had this mini library. And I would check it out. You could have it for 2 weeks and you had to bring it back for a week and then you could check it out. So I checked it out again every 3 weeks. I had it for 2 of those 3 weeks. One day, my dad, we had this side table where he put everything that needed to be taken care of, the mail, the keys, everything. And that book was there. And he said, isn't it about time you returned that? And I said, I'm taking it back today, Dad. He said, that's good because you don't want to pay any fines. Because I took it back that day and I'm putting it on the shelf and Mrs. Sibbard comes over and says, Alan, I need to talk to you. And that's never good. You know, it's like when they put those little notes and they stuck them to your shirt. I always wanted to read those, but I figured I could never get the pin through the holes in the note again. So then Mom would know I'd read it. And I said, yeah. And she said, you know, that bird book, we're going to get a new one. You just well have that. I want you to have that. That's yours. We're getting a new one. You take it home. So I took it home, man. I was so excited on that bus. Ed Reisted was my bus driver, and he had me sit right behind him because he liked me that much. And we're driving back, and I'm reading that book that I've read so many times. I've almost worn it out, looking at all those bird pictures. I love birds. And I go home, and I throw it on that side table with the keys and the mail and everything. The next morning, I'm getting up and going to school. My dad said, thought I told you to take that book back. Now you're going to have a fine. You're paying it. I'm not paying it. You need to learn responsibility. And I said, Mrs. Sibbard said I could have that book. Dad says, no, we don't take stuff. That's a slippery road. Once you start taking stuff, people will be bringing stuff because they think you need everything. He said, you take it back. And I said, but he said, take it back. And you couldn't argue with Dad. So I'm on the bus, and I got that book in my hand sitting right behind Ed Reisted because he would make sure all my accommodations were just perfect on my bus ride. And I get to school, and I'm putting it back on the shelf, and Mrs. Sibbard comes over and says, what are you doing? I said, my dad says we shouldn't accept free things because it's just not a good. She said, oh, your father. I don't know what's wrong with that generation. They're just so worried somebody thinks they need help. She said, what did he say? He said, we don't take free things. And she said, well, would you be willing to buy this book? And I said, of course I will. And she said, well, I don't know how much to charge you. What do you have? Oh, I had a nickel, a penny, and a button off some shirt. And she said, that's the exact price I need. Well, I took that book. I'm back on the bus going home, and I'm reading it again. I'm just so happy. And I get home, and this time I make sure I throw it on that side table so Dad can see it. I just put it right there. I even open it up, and then I look at it close, seeing which way to make sure he'd see it. And then he comes in, and he said, look, last time I'm going to tell you now, I told you to take that book back. And I said, I did. Well, what's it doing here? And I said, I bought. He said, well, good. I hope you learned a lesson from this whole experience. I did. I learned it. Mrs. Sibbard, my 3rd and 4th grade teacher, was one of the best people on earth. And I don't think she ever spent that 6 cents and a button. I just have that feeling, but I still have that bird book.
Nice. So if someone asked Al Batt, how did you make your living? What would be the answer?
Telling stories. Yeah.
Fascinating.
My dad said, is that a real job? He said, and I said, yeah, it is. And he said, well, good. Dad always told me you should find something that you like to do and then find a way to make a living at it. And that's what I found. I write and I tell stories, do radio shows, used to do TV shows, and do all these wonderful, wonderful things that I enjoy and can't get enough of. I love what I do.
Well, Al, this has been really a big delight. It's a joy to talk to you. I'd rather do it in person. Do you have one final piece of advice for our audience?
I hope you all get out there today and have the very best day of your life, because this is the only one you're getting of this day. So go out there and call somebody, write a letter to somebody, and tell them how much they mean to you, how they made a difference in your life, and that you love them and you appreciate them. And boy, it'll be a happy world if we can all do that once a day.
Al Batt, thanks for sharing. Thanks for telling stories. We'll see you on the other side, wherever that might be.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, all.
Stay tuned for more on Farm Connections.
From their home base in rural Nicollet, Minnesota, locally raised Compart Family Farms premium Duroc pork products are shipped across the United States. Some of their cuts are served in top restaurants across the country, including New York City. From sausages and bacon to chops and ribs, Compart pork products are in demand. Chris Compart says consumers want to make the connection to where their food is produced.
We go all the way into Maine, down to Florida, out to California. Haven't exported any out of that area, but pretty much the continental U.S., we can get it to them.
The COVID-19 outbreak has forced many people to shelter in place and has caused challenges in the pork processing system. That has led to increased interest among consumers in utilizing local meat processors. In many cases, local butchers are booked weeks or even months in advance.
People want to maybe support the smaller person, and you go into the big box stores, and who knows where that came from and who's behind it.
Beyond simply selling pork, Compart's Duroc hogs also are specially bred. That breeding results in high-quality meat that goes great on the plate.
I think a lot of people want to make that connection with who raised the animals and make that connection that way. And one thing that, we've also bred these animals, and we have the genetic program behind them that gives them more marbling and more flavor and more taste. And that's what we've done here at Compart's. Instead of worrying about cheaper diets and things like that, we feed them the extra things that make pork better pork.
With the coronavirus such a big part of our life, people's habits have changed. Eating is one of those. In the case of meat, people want locally grown meat, and meat markets and sources like Compart's are growing, and people are enjoying a great product grown close to home. This is Lynn Kettleson reporting.
Change, whether good or bad, requires us to adjust the way we do things. In turn, it provides us the opportunity to expand our horizons and reinvigorate our old practices. I'm Dan Hoffman. Thanks for joining us on Farm Connections.